Hey guys, I'm doing a quick review of what we talked about today in Social Studies 10. So today we talked about basic economics, economic globalization, fixed and floating exchange rates. Please go over that for the review section. What I'm going to do is I'm going to explain Keynesian economics because that's essentially what a lot of people struggle with. And so anytime we talk about Keynesian economics, one of the things you got to understand is something called the business cycle. And so the business cycle essentially is what happens when the ideas of Adam Smith are applied, and essentially the economy goes through these periods of ups and downs. So it looks something like this, right? Sorry, it sucks. And so essentially what starts to happen is that we can split up the business cycle into a bunch of parts. This part where it goes up, we call it the boom phase. Part where it goes down, we call it the bust. This movement towards the top, we call it the recovery. This movement towards the bottom, we call it the recession. And the very bottom, we call it the depression. And the very top, we call it the peak. And so essentially what John Maynard Keynes tells us is that the two most dangerous points in the business cycle are the depression and the peak. And so we want to make sure we avoid the depression and the peak, right? So these are super dangerous. We want to make sure we avoid them. And so if Keynesian policy is applied, essentially the business cycle will look something like this. Blue dot. We essentially have the up and down periods, but it's just not as extreme. And so there's some tools that Keynes uses in order to regulate the business cycle to make sure we avoid the peak and the depression. And the two tools that we use are called fiscal policy and monetary policy. And so I'm going to explain what fiscal and monetary policy looks like during the boom phase, and what we got to do is we just flip it for the bust phase. And so fiscal policy essentially has two parts within it, spending and taxes. And so with fiscal policy, the best way to remember it is through the acronym FIST. So fiscal is spending and taxes. And what we do with our spending is we actually decrease our spending and increase our taxes as we head towards the peak, because the problem with the peak is inflation. If you want to prevent inflation, you want to decrease the spending so there's not as much money circulating, and increase taxes so people do not spend money. And what we do with our monetary policy is made up of two parts. Think of Mike, and the two parts are interest rates and currency printing. So once again, we want to avoid the peak because the peak has got maximum inflation. And so what we do with interest rates is we increase interest rates so people are not as likely to take out loans, and we decrease currency printing so there's not as much money circulating. And so this is what happens during the boom phase. So essentially during the boom phase, we want to slow down the economy to prevent the peak, and we want to speed up the economy as we head towards the depression, because we want to prevent the depression because of maximum unemployment. So that's essentially those two tools that John Maynard Keynes talks about. So the last thing we talked about with Keynesian economics is the vicious and virtuous cycle. And so the vicious cycle essentially looks like this. People save money, and by saving money, businesses lose money. And when businesses lose money, they fire workers. And when you fired workers also save money. And so essentially the vicious cycle says that if you save money, that's actually the fastest way to long-term poverty, because businesses will lose money, those workers will not spend, and essentially those workers result in more people losing their money. And so John Maynard Keynes talks to something called the paradox of thrift. Right, and the virtuous cycle is essentially the opposite. So vicious is bad, virtuous is opposite. And the virtuous cycle looks like this. People spend, and once people spend, businesses make money. And those businesses hire more workers, and those workers spend money. And so John Maynard Keynes says, if you want to get people spending, you want to get the economy going, people spend money, and the wealth essentially cycles through. And so that's a quick review of Keynesian economics, the business cycle. Go over the virtuous and vicious cycles, those tools, monetary and fiscal policy, and know those basic developments for the review section. And that is all you got to know for tomorrow. See you guys later.